Let's get started. Good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are coming from. In Australia, it's 4 o'clock. In the UK, it's very early in the morning. So thanks, Deborah, for joining me. For those that don't know me, my name's Trina Sunday, and through my consultancy, Reimagine HR, we are exploring new thinking, trying to look at different ways of levelling up our people practices and working to really inspire and enable HR teams to do great HR. Deborah Wilkes is joining me today to chat about all things HR and recent research that her organisation, Enable HR International, have done into what some of the themes are around taking HR to the next level. So we're going to have a bit of a chat about that. Deborah's got extensive experience in the HR space across Europe and also in management and leadership, and then more recently specialising in HR effectiveness. She's an author of a book, Empowering HR, and we were introduced through Dave Ulrich. And, you know, it's been a great partnership. So I'm really happy to bring this conversation to you today. Is there anything that you want to add, Debbie?
No, we love to say, don't we, that we were introduced by Dave Ulrich. I mean, that's just got to be the best. So, yeah, because Dave recognised that both of us really care about HR and are really trying to develop a different approach. So I'm really pleased to be with you. And yes, it is a bit early here. And I apologise for the croak, because here it's the end of winter and we've all got, you know, those bugs and things.
Not COVID, I hope.
Bear with me.
So Deborah might share some slides as we go through. But one of the things that I really wanted to have a chat about was trying to understand, Debbie, around the research that you did with your business partner, George Naylor. And obviously you've gone out globally to HR leaders and HR practitioners around how to take HR to the next level. And I was hoping you might be able to give us some context around what you did and just at a high level kind of what that process looks like.
Yeah, well, we got the idea for this survey actually from our previous survey. So we did one last year that was researching HR's reputation. And the strap line to that was, has the pandemic helped HR to rise up and grasp more influence, or has it forced HR down more into the reactive cycle? So we got some great data from that. And then, of course, you look at it and you think, well, that's really interesting. And also there's a whole other layer that we'd like to dig down into. So what we did was we collated 13 headings, which were picked up out of the reputation report and others that we get from our clients and the groups that we work with. And this time we said, pick which of these top 13 challenges you would say are your most difficult. So people picked their top 3. And then we asked the important question, why is this so hard?
Why? Do you have all the answers? That's why people are here today.
Well, yeah. Well, that
we
was
need
the
answers, people. We want solutions. We want
exactly,
answers.
Exactly. So, yeah, that's what we really wanted to get down to. So why is it so hard? Because actually it's those issues that we need to find the solutions to.
So the top 5 themes that came out of this report, are they in order of what was seen to be the most difficult? And we're going to chat about them. There's 5 key themes that came out that I'd kind of shared with people along with the links to the report. But I think the power's in the conversation, right? It's in the conversation around what did you see and then what are we seeing respectively from our opposite sides of the globe. But were those 5 kind of in order, or is it just a top 5 generally?
Well, just to clarify, we had our top 5 choices from the 13 statements, and we have the percentages next to those in the report. But the themes, which I think you're talking about, are the themes that emerged. So just to explain, we asked people which would be your top 3 of these statements, And then I went through all the data to pick out the themes that they were mentioning when they were saying, why is this hard? So all the themes go across all the statements. So, for example, they might have picked being involved earlier in key decisions as one of their top 3 statements. But then underneath, when we said to them, well, why is this hard? That's when we came up with the 5 themes. And the top one was the mindset of business leaders. So nearly everybody mentioned that.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Because it's much easier for us to blame them, let's be honest, when things are feeling a bit tricky and a bit hard. And I think, so part of what I saw you describing that was kind of that there's a history and a culture and, you know, closed minds kind of getting in the way of building really strategic and operational partnerships. I think the power of your research, which is different, say, to lots of surveys that are done by the Big Four or everything else, is that you immerse yourselves in qualitative data and do the hard work about interpreting text, which for a lot of organizations is too hard, because you've got to read a lot of things, synthesize a lot of things, and really kind of bring it together. So what was it that kind of, you know, resonated with most people around the business leader mindset? What came through?
Well, definitely, as you say, the fact that there's a legacy there, there's a history. So we started off as an admin function. And so pulling out of that is difficult. And it's because of senior leaders' perceptions, but it's also about our perceptions of ourselves. We've got to be honest about that. And that actually was also one of the themes that came out of digging into all those phrases that people used. You could feel it coming through that some people in our HR community aren't feeling very confident. And so there's this feeling of, one way of describing it is like a bucket. There's a feeling of HR people feeling like they're in a bucket. And they're at the bottom of the bucket. Maybe that's because of the history and the position they start out at. And then when they get really, really busy, it's just like all this work is coming into the bucket and burying them. And we're kind of at the stage at the moment where we're saying, hang on a minute, will you please help me out of this bucket? Because for me to do this by myself is actually really hard. Because we know that as HR leaders, we've got to be courageous. We've got to be articulate about explaining the connections between HR and the business. But how do you do that? How do you build the confidence and the courage if you feel like you're in the bottom of the bucket?
Because I think it's one of, it's interesting because I think in a lot of the work that I'm doing with clients here, there's definitely some challenges around expectations from the business around what HR's function is, right? And through the pandemic, obviously, we saw some change. We saw shackles come off bureaucracy. We saw HR being engaged early, you know, because we cut away from red tape because we didn't have time, certainly in the early crisis management stages, where I've seen a lot revert back then. I've also kind of seen where we've had HR teams, and it leads into a different theme, so I won't go there too much, but carved up so much in terms of resources that transactional activity, the business hasn't changed their mindset about what they expect from HR. But I think part of the reality is the business often wants you to do their admin. And I think part of the tension and the challenge for HR is business leaders often are quite happy with us sitting in a space of administratively supporting their processes because I don't want to step into it because, incredibly busy, don't have time. So I think that's part of the challenge in terms of repositioning our role with business leaders, right? That's part of the challenge in terms of how we do that moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because the other one was around resource issues. So I do a lot of consultative coaching, and I work with a lot of HR teams in terms of transformation support, and then clients obviously in terms of HR consulting generally. And resource issues for HR is just an overwhelming problem, right? People are talking about lack of staff, that legacy of the fact that their HR workforce has been decimated essentially in terms of some of the budgetary constraints that organisations have been facing. They don't have time. A lot of the systems are not robust. I shouldn't be surprised by now, but it's a challenge when you look at how many HR teams are trying to drive great HR when they've got limited access to data. They don't have good workforce analytics. And so, the workload becomes really administrative. And it's frustrating because you're in that transactional kind of space and you're not adding the value that you want to. What are some of the themes that are coming through from you from that perspective in terms of the resource issues?
Yeah, I think for me, the resource issue is really closely tied up with HR tech. And I was really confused about HR tech, to be honest, because when you hear the suppliers talk about it, you would think it was the answer to all our prayers.
Trying to sell you something.
Come in. I know. Well, in theory, it should be, shouldn't it? They come in and, they just build you a nice system and everything talks to each other and life is simpler for everybody. But actually, there are things that get in the way. And I think one of them is that, actually, a lot of the HR tech companies don't really understand the day-to-day business as usual aspects of HR. And also that for many HR teams, they've actually got discrete systems that work. So they've got a performance management system, they've got a talent management system, a recruitment system, payroll, obviously. They've got these different systems that actually work, but they're not getting the benefit of having them all integrated. So to chuck out all of those things that do actually work and get a new system in just seems like a nightmare. So I think that the HR tech suppliers have really got to pull together a more flexible offering, because really HR could benefit from a lot more tech. But even if you think about the other side of that, which is, if HR could get rid of the transactional work that bogs them down, what is the great value that they could add to the organization? So we've got to be really clear about that as well. So what would it look like if we could get rid of this transactional work and engage with you as true business partners and really partner? Because that in itself, I know, is a term that's gets mixed responses, because you can have the job title but not actually be allowed to do the business partnering. Actually, there was a great quote from somebody that's in the report when we talked about this heading, the mindset of business leaders. Somebody said, we are not allowed to partner with the business.
Oh, did they elaborate? What?
There's a whole story behind that, isn't that? Well, like I'm thinking, I want to ask you about that, but I kind of know what they mean. You mentioned it earlier. In many cases, it's actually very convenient for business leaders to keep HR where they are at the moment, because they do want them to do the admin, and they don't want them to say things that are inconvenient. So it's much more convenient to say, okay, HR person, please sort out this performance issue for me. It's less convenient for HR to say, well, actually, let's talk about basically what you're saying, although you put it more politely, is let's talk about how your management style has led to this situation, because that's the best longer term way of us fixing these performance issues that you keep having. So we can achieve it conversation by conversation, and you have to have senior leaders' support. So creating partnership has to be multi-level. So you have to have the senior people in HR explaining to the top people in the business why partnering is good for business. And then when, because this is classic, I've heard this so many times, people the next level down are responding in the way they feel has been agreed and saying to their line manager, well, what we're going to do going forward is more partnering. So this means that what we're going to do is we're going to sit down and we're going to look at the aspects or the people aspects in your team so that I can add real value in how we move forward. And that line manager goes back to his boss and says, you know what, they're just being so difficult in HR now because I just want them to sort a performance issue out and they're making it so difficult. So that at that point, the business leader has got to say, yeah, let me explain why this is and why HR are going to operate differently going forward. So you have to have that multi-level approach.
And that's where the challenge is, right, in terms of where we started some of this around the business leader mindset. It's leadership generally, right? Like depending on where and the culture in organizations, whether there is accountability to and true empowerment. So not tokenistic empowerment where we say that managers can make decisions, but as long as we've signed off on them. So I think that, there's a lot in terms of then being able to have that partnership conversation is one where it goes back to then, well, what's the view of leadership and where does that stop and start? And, where's the capability in that space to have courageous conversations and things like that. So I think there's a lot of challenges, but also opportunity to be able to step into those conversations. A lot of the clients that I've been working with have talked to me around having some confidence or a lack of confidence in some of those, kind of areas. I think that part of it is a language issue. I'm not sure what your observation is, but just the concept of, and you alluded to it, HR business partner, it means different things to different people. And it's been really interesting in my work where I work predominantly with HR teams who are looking to level up. I work with HR leaders that are wanting to, do things differently. And there's all slightly different definitions around how they view what partnering with the business is. So I think it's interesting around how you start that conversation and awareness around our terminology.
And the language you use in meetings and how you position what it is that you want to do.
Yeah.
So there's a story from my background that I'm not proud of, but it was a great learning moment when I was responsible for some European markets. And we knew there was a real issue in France with turnover of sales reps. So I went over, did the research, and there really was a salary shortfall. They were underpaid significantly. So I worked out, built the spreadsheet. This is what we need to do to put it right. And it was quite a big number. And I thought, our European president is never going to give me the budget for this. So I trimmed it. I thought, well, we could do 1% this year on top of annual. We can do another percent next year, la-di-da-di-da. So I went in with my presentation and I said, this is obviously causing real problems in the French operation and the managers are having to spend all their time hiring. But I was just speaking HR language. What I should have done was gone in there and said, it'll cost you 1% budget, but it'll increase sales by 3% in France. Because if we keep these sales reps on their territories, the evidence is that sales go up. That's the only language that guy would understand.
I think it's the only language
that's smarter at that.
Yeah, and I think, it is part of and at the core of how we prove our value, right? So when we talk about proving the value of HR, if we're not using business metrics, if we're not driving and enabling the business agenda, not the HR agenda, and if we're not, kind of looking at how we can measure things in business terms, and I have a lot of HR leaders say, well, we can't quantify in business terms some of the dollars and values that we have.
Yeah.
But I think there is enough quantitative data out there to look at what cost of replacement is, to support turnover, where we are in terms of retraining, and especially with there's literature out there now around, 30% capability, competencies written into JDs right now are going to become redundant by 2025. Well, if we're trying to get some support and investment and buy-in for workforce planning, capability, learning and development type things, then we need to be able to shift to, well, how is that capability going to drive sales? How is it going to drive revenue? How is it going to shift the needle in terms of reducing expenses? So a lot of the time it's not about making profit, or in your example, but it's definitely about minimizing cost. And the better and the leaner we are at some of that, then the more that's going to, add value. I do see your hand there, Tim, and I'll come to you in a second. So I think, it's interesting because it comes back as well to then, if you're not using that business language, you're not going to be invited in to be having business conversations, right? So that ability to influence.
And I heard a great story yesterday about from a CHRO who it was a big warehousing business, wholesale business. So we can all imagine, going into warehouse and talking to the operations manager there. And so he actually went in and said, how do you feel about your costs? And the guy said, well, they had 100% turnover of these warehouse staff.
100%.
That is high. 100%. So this CHRO went in, and so he was saying, so I bet, what's your biggest issue? And the guy says, well, I need to cut costs. It's all about margin. So the conversation about doing leadership development, which is actually where the CHRO wanted to go, started with the business issue of reducing costs. So that's what we've got to get really smart at doing, going out into our own businesses. And because we can identify things easily, if there are performance issues and that somebody's, say you've got a team leader and he has 3 performance issues, then, and you've got 10 team leaders, then you do the multiplication, because big numbers get the attention of senior leaders.
Yeah.
So if you're saying, we've got 30 people who are underperforming at the moment, would you like to do something about that? Then that's costing you, I don't know, $10,000 for each one. So roll that up. That's a big number. So we've got to start with the business number and make the link.
Yeah, because I think it's in programs that I'm running, the business acumen and the commercial mindset stuff is probably the biggest. That and tech is the biggest kind of capability leap, I would say, that I'm working with HR teams on. And it is quite business specific, but there's models that kind of support it. I always talk around people leaning on marketing and what marketing do for opportunities to learn, because if we think about marketing, who again are driving comms, driving a brand, whether it's employer brand, external brand, comms and marketing who are, getting investment to run programs. So it's a cost to a business, marketing and comms, right? But I have HR people say it's easy for marketing. They get everything signed off straight away. It's like, but it's because they link the behavior change to the customer experience to the end game in terms of profit and margin. And as HR practitioners, we need to be able to build our rationale around, employer brand and the fit. So the buyer's remorse when new candidates come in and we've sold them something that's not true. All the way through that employer brand, employee experience, and then how that translates in terms of the customer experience. And I think that, the closer we are with marketing and drawing on some of those principles, the better. You talk a bit about mindset of HR and us holding on to, I think you said, ideas of value and emphasis. What did you mean by that? What was showing up in the HR mindset space in terms of the data that came back for you?
Yeah, I think it's partly HR's beliefs about themselves.
Yeah.
and also HR's belief that they can actually change the way things are.
Mm-hmm.
So those two things together, because there were a few quotes saying it's never going to change.
Yeah.
Of course, if you've got that mindset, it isn't actually ever going to change, is it?
Yeah.
So that is a real challenge for us to really help each other build courage and determination, which I know you're great at inspiring HR people to really go for it and develop their skills. And there was a real insight in our reputation survey. As I mentioned, it did inspire this second one, where we asked the same question we asked a question in 3 ways. And this was so revealing.
Mm.
The first question was, what are business leaders talking about? So then it would be sales, profit, growth, survival, all business language. And then we said, what do you want your HR function to be known for?
Mm-hmm.
And they'd said, being business savvy, adding value to the business, being true partners. Again, really strong business focused.
Yeah.
When we asked HR people how they want to be seen personally, the answers are completely different. It was about being values led, supportive, team players, approachable.
Yeah.
And we all know that those things really matter to HR people. So we have to help HR people see that there is an and there. You can be business savvy and credible, and also approachable, team player, empathetic. It's quite an ask, but we can do it.
I think it's one of the things that's come through a little bit is, and you touched on it in terms of there's some comments in your data around that nothing's going to change. I can feel that from a portion of our HR community, and clearly not the people that are on this call, because these people are game changers and wanting to take HR to the next level. But I think that there's a challenge, though, when you are an inspired change agent that's wanting to drive improvement in people practices, who's wanting to partner with a business in the truest sense, who's wanting to actually make a difference to an organisation's outcomes. It's hard to do that if the HR leadership above you is not in the same space. That's tricky. Yeah. Super tricky. And we can't sugarcoat that. Sometimes you've got to figure out how you can build your relationships to work around it. And one of the things, in the work that we've done together, and obviously, your organisation's built the Enable HR profiling system, and you talk about the 7 enablers, but one of them being connections is, you can build connections. Like I say to my HR leadership game changers, that you have to find your workaround. You have to find where your partners are who have an appetite for change, because I think we tend to focus on all the change resistors, right? The 80% of people that might not want us to do anything differently.
That's so true.
If we put all of our energy into those people, we know what the outcome's going to be. So I kind of feel like that's energy that's not going to, A, fill us up, B, we get the bruising on our forehead, but we don't get to shift it because they don't want to do anything differently. Where if we focus on the pockets in our organizations, our businesses, where leaders do want to do things differently, whether it's performance management, how we recruit people, how we onboard them, which we do quite badly in a lot of sectors, then you get the fear of missing out and the peer pressure that comes from everything being great and improving over here, and then suddenly you can get a change movement happening. But I think that mindset of HR is an interesting one, because I think that's probably where you saw some themes around confidence could potentially be improved, and also I guess that misalignment around the business and the HR agenda in some spaces. And I think if we're taking HR to the next level, then we fundamentally need to be looking at how HR is truly enabling a business agenda. To the extent where we may not have HR strategy, we do, of course, but it sits within the business strategy. not as our own kind of plan or, something that sits alongside. What are your observations of that?
Yes, that definitely came out in the survey. A few people saying, actually, it's my HR leadership that I've got the problem with. And I do think that some of it is absolutely workload. I've been working with a client recently, who I won't mention anything about them because I'm not going to be. Well, he's a great guy and he's so capable.
Probably still won't name him.
But no.
But you're great. But if you ever see this, you're great.
There's a but coming, don't you? So one of the things we needed to do was build a new HR strategy. And as part of the process, I interviewed several senior stakeholders. So I was making a really good list of their business goals, the challenges they were facing, where they wanted to go in the future. And then said, and I just wrote it all down, sent it over to the guy, and had some ideas for therefore these are some of the things that should be in the strategy, and here's how we could position them. And he said to me, oh, so what you're saying is we start with the business issues and then we explain why the elements in our HR strategy relate to the business strategy. And of course I'm thinking, well, yes, obviously. But that guy has been so overworked for so long and under-resourced. He just hasn't had time to think about it. He's kind of got some generic thing out of a I don't know, a webinar or Google, or something out of a box. Google, yes. And he said, yes, we should be doing this in diversity and inclusion. We should be doing this in leadership development. But there's no connection.
Yeah.
And we've got to get so smart at making the connection. So, of course, because I had the opportunity, this is what I always encourage HR leaders to do. The danger is, so say for that guy, to arrange those meetings with those people that he's been working with for 10 years and say, actually, what I want to do is I want to come down Zoom, not down to your office probably. I want to have an hour with you to find out what really goes on in your part of the organization, what your challenges are, what you really want us to work on. He's going to think, I can't ask those questions because I'm supposed to know the answers. How can I ask those questions when I've been here all this time? But I think if you do it within a context, this is what I'm always saying on our programs, actually be explicit. I know you really well. We've worked together for years, but actually, can I come and ask you these big questions? What is it like doing your job? What keeps you awake at night? What do you really want me to help you with? I know that I say to you, we should be doing manager development. We should be working harder on performance management. But actually, what are your real challenges? And then once you do that, you can take that relationship to a new level. Because that's really how we take HR to the next level, is by working relationship by relationship.
Yeah. And it still comes back to meeting those people's needs, right? Like I think if we are service providers at the end of the day. And so even if you do have that 10-year legacy, I think if the conversations are positioned the right way, as you say, it's the right context where it's kind of like, I want to be able to help you in the best way possible. I don't want to be making assumptions, one size fits all, just because things are happening in other areas of the organization. It might not be what's, it's that bringing people in around, well, what are the real needs in that space? So I think that, it's a critical part, right? But it's never too late to be able to build that. And I think the reality is, if people think it is too late, there's an element of we need to check in with ourselves around whether we're in the right space. I don't say that lightly because I'm not, and I don't say that to be critical of HR, because I know the most phenomenal HR practitioners that inspire me every day. And I love that there is so much passion to drive reform in their organisations, but they are overworked. They're tired, between the pandemic and and it's not all pandemic, but, if it's not the pandemic, the reality is it's going to be something else. And often we talk about the new normal, and I find that a bit difficult, and I find that it's like, who are we to know what the new normal is going to be? This is normal. So it's just normal being constant and fast-paced change that we need to be able to respond to. So
it's big stuff as well, isn't it? Really, really big stuff, like, the future of work, making decisions about how you're going to accommodate employee choice. I mean, that is a really big shift, isn't it, during the pandemic?
What are your observations in the UK of what organisations are doing in that space? So I've seen some really interesting things which lend to, depending on the culture of an organisation. So if it's a fear-based insecure, if it's kind of leaders coming from a place of insecurity, then there's micromanagement and the trying to put spyware or screen capture software onto PCs to take photos, and like just things where I'm like, wait, what? Just when you think you couldn't be confronted by more lack of trust, there it is. But I think, but there's other organisations obviously which have let their people thrive because they've acknowledged that there's different ways of working. What are you saying in the UK in that regard?
Well, I think actually there are different categories. So in the organisations where you've got really expensive talent, so say, if you employ graduates, if you're a tech company, and I use the word tech broadly, so it could be pharmaceutical or companies where you really need the brains, then those people know their value and they know they're mobile as well. So whereas they might have felt limited before by the length of their commute, they don't now. So that's thrown the whole thing up right in the air, especially in the UK, because of course we're tiny anyway, aren't we? Might be a bit more tricky in Australia to
bit of a commute
live in Perth and work in Melbourne or something, but maybe not, because you could still get there easily. So much has been thrown up in the air, and you're quite right to major on this word trust. Because if people don't feel trusted after having absolutely bust their guts to work from home, keep their businesses going, then they just feel insulted if afterwards there's some kind of sign that if you're not in the office, we don't feel we can trust you. It's just nonsense now. People won't stand for it. So you've got these organizations where you need qualified people and they know their worth. And a lot of those, the leaders are actually being more intelligent about it, but not everywhere. There was KPMG, wasn't there, a while ago saying, we will have everybody back to work. And there's, been a riot.
Yeah.
And then you've got other organizations where you've got the lower skilled workers who actually have much fewer choices. And so I feel that the standing of HR varies a lot depending on the kind of business that you're in.
Because so we've got a bit of us and them that's emerging. I'm pretty sure Maria's on this call as well, and it's an issue in her care industry. So, where you can't do work remotely, it's interesting how that's throwing up some inequity, feelings of inequity, that it's not fair, that there's certain, parts of workforces that can work hybrid, that can work remotely, where your frontline staff obviously are on the front line and they're immersed in whatever it is that they're doing. And so, we talked about the fact that, well, we still need to go to those people though and be saying, well, how can we make your work easier? How can we make you feel safer? How can we, look at changing the way you work to make it better, in the same way that we're jumping over the hurdles that in the more obvious spaces for, say, they call them knowledge workers, which I find really offensive, but, that portion of workforce. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see where that goes. Did you want to
Yeah, I
add
think the
anything,
thing-
Debbie, before we kind of maybe open up for some questions? Tim's had his hand up very politely for a
Yeah,
very
I'm
long
dying to know
time.
what Tim's going to say. Yeah, I think care workers that's a really good example. They are so valuable and they've been underpaid. And I mean, here that's a government system of not paying enough
Same here.
within the system to pay them. So I do think there are going to be some big shifts because people are, there's a sense of more respect for some workers who actually weren't given enough respect before.
Yeah.
So I really hope that gives us more leveling out of people. To be a care worker, you don't need the qualifications, but you definitely need the character, the skill, the strength, the empathy. And we need to put a price on that.
Yeah. And I think there's just a mobility that's going to come from, it's hard to attract those workers anyway. We may then be training them up. We're then looking at a lot of significant migrant workforce in a lot of different areas and industries as well in that space. And then so we might invest heavily and then we have high mobility and we lose workers anyway because it's a tough industry, some of those industries. Tim, did you want to unmute and let us know what your thoughts are or what your question might be?
Oh, g'day. Yes, my question comes from a bit of my background. Since my first retirement, I've been teaching HR at Taken University. And one of the things we talk about is leadership. And leadership's been mentioned a number of times as a title, which is fascinating because I've always found and taught that leadership is earned, not granted by position in a job. So, and that was an issue. The other thing is that HR, in many ways, are not leading because they stay away from analytics. In fact, when I ask my students about it, even my students don't want to deal with it because they feel very uncomfortable. So I'm doing HR, I'm doing people stuff. I'm not doing accounting or finance or something like that. I said, we're going to have to do a good job. So, my first point was when I first put my hand up was that you mentioned a number of times leaders, but then you gave examples of why they're not leaders.
Yeah. Good observation, Tim. I think that, we have leadership, which, as you point out, is inherent. There's a difference between management and leadership, right? You've got management, which is by position and authority. Leadership, which inherently is going to come from a place of, it's head versus heart a lot of the time. Not everyone is a natural leader, but will find themselves in a position of power where they are expected to lead teams and lead outcomes, lead results. I honestly feel like it's our biggest challenge. It's definitely a channel. But it's our biggest challenge around how we look at leadership across all of our organisations, including HR leadership. And what that means and how we can step up. Because it's been a bit interesting for me how sometimes we think of HR leaders as different to the other leaders in the business. And I find that really interesting. It's kind of, but I think part of it is our reputation or our profile, our brand, not seeing us positioned as, well, no, I'm a business leader. I just happen to work in HR. What are your thoughts, Debbie?
Well, picking up those 2 points, I think leadership generally has got to change. One of the things that we certainly heard over here was that some of the leaders who weren't necessarily valued pre-pandemic, because they were maybe quieter, they just got on with the job, worked with their teams, they weren't getting the attention, they weren't shining. But then during the pandemic, they absolutely shone because they were authentic with their teams. They'd already established trust. So it was harder to maintain trust through the screen. It's much harder to build trust through a screen. And some of the leaders who previously had been highly regarded, probably because, they would strut around and attract attention and, be the voice in meetings, those people didn't actually manage to maintain the performance of their teams. So a lot of organizations are taking a different view of what leadership really is. So I think that's a really good point, Tim, that it's about who you are and what you do, not the title. And the other question about what is it about being a leader in HR, I do actually think it's different.
Tell me more about that.
Yeah, I think in HR, you know, when you're a leader, that you are being watched for your values, your ethics, much more than any other leader in the business.
Sometimes unfairly, right? You have to be a superhuman.
Yeah, exactly.
A super faultless human that can't make a mistake because
who never says anything bad about anyone, who is always constructive, who will always role model mature, sensible decision making, when actually in the back of your mind you're thinking, oh, come on, this is absolute rubbish, you know. And if you were in a different function, if you were the sales director, people would be used to you saying, oh, come on, you know, this is rubbish. But it's the values piece, I think, that as the HR leader, and I know Rich Roberts is here, and Rich will have a view on this, please chip in, that you, as a leader in HR, you have to maintain your integrity. You have to be authentic, because other people will tell if you're not. So that does mean that when you're in conversations with senior leaders, you kind of need to be the honest broker. You need to push back. You need to say if you disagree with the position they're taking. Because whereas somebody in another function probably would say, well, I disagree, but it doesn't matter because that's not my area. The other thing about HR is that everything is our area. Every single person in the organization is within our reach. Whereas if you're I mean, it could be a big project, but if you're implementing something as a sales director, the odds are it's just going to be in the sales function. Whereas in HR, we're probably rolling something out across the whole organization. So I think it's because of the values and the reach that we do have special responsibilities in HR.
And I agree with that there is not everybody, because it depends on how you come into the HR space as well. But I think that there is a values-based leadership premise that comes from HR people generally. So I do think that that's true. But I also find it really challenging sometimes that we're not holding our other business leaders to the same account of integrity and ethics in the room. And so what I struggle with is the double standard that emerges then sometimes, where, you know, HR need to be squeaky clean, which then comes to a point where people aren't being their natural selves. And we talk about, you know, put the human back in human resources, or, you know, trying to humanize HR, and because there's an element of, you know, people are scared to kind of just, I mean, I'm a straight shooter and I can't help it. And I have to warn clients and warn employers that that's how I come into the role. Like I come in with positive intent and constructive challenge, but with a view that I won't hold back my opinions. I mean, if that's an issue, I'm probably not the right fit, you know, but I think, yeah, it's interesting. And then I think it lends to another point that Tim made with the, you know, why people come into HR. So I say it a bit tongue in cheek, but if I have really young HR graduates say to me, oh, I want to work in HR because I love people, there's a part of me that's like, don't do it. Get out. Because there's a degree of there's a tension and there's a difficulty a lot of the time around, we have to make tough decisions. And the more senior and the more specialized, depending on what space you're in, there are tough things that need to be done sometimes. And the business savviness and that commercial acumen and the numbers that Tim's talking about, sometimes your strengths might lie in different areas. And so I think the challenge is trying to know what your superpowers are, as I call them, but then be mindful of the fact that you need to step up your capability in the other areas, because you need both. You need the value-based side, but you also need the data acumen, and to be able to tell a story with data.
And I think also it's not just about spreadsheets. It's about going to the front line of your organization. Like one of the best things I ever did was spend a day with a sales rep in a company where we were selling medical devices. Because not only do you really, really learn about what makes a sale and what doesn't, but you can also come back to meetings really well armed with the business argument for why you need training in certain areas, or why I remember having a debate about recruiting sales reps, and there's like a classic dilemma between, do we want a salesperson who when they're with the client, there's usually a point where they're thinking, am I going to really go for the sale, or am I going to back off in order to preserve the relationship? Well, we definitely needed the latter. It was a relationship sale. And so that was a debate that I could have with the managers, having been there with the customer. And so I think that's why HR people have got to, and it's more comfortable as well than sitting down with the spreadsheets, because analytics isn't the whole answer.
Yeah.
And
it's only as good as the data that you have, right? So most teams I'm working with, if you don't have robust systems and you don't have really kind of valuable data, then it's just not going to tell you anything. And it's the same with, we go through the motions of this dashboard life that we lead sometimes. And execs aren't looking at it. No one's kind of reading them. It's not, because it's not telling them anything meaningful. And, I think that it's a different kind of P&L report if it's a people and leader report, or it's different, like if it's, if you're putting something to exec where it's about, well, this is what's happening in the people space and this is how much money it's cost us this quarter. This is what we project to be losses over the next 12 months from our undesirable turnover, because obviously there's healthy turnover. We all know that in some respects. But yeah, it's being able to tell the story with the data. And I don't think you can do that if you're not having conversations with people. And change comes from conversations, and in my experience. And, if we're wanting to drive a change movement and trying to get some groundswell around doing things differently, then it's one conversation at a time. To which I have some HR people will say to me quite quickly, I don't have time for that. What do you say to people that are in the trenches that are struggling with the overwhelm and the over-resource, yet they want to level up? Where do they start?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that is the area that you and I are passionate about, isn't it? Because we've got really, really committed, conscientious and skilled HR people who are in the bucket still.
Yeah.
And it's so hard to get out. There are obviously also HR people who are in a great situation in an organization that really respects HR. And so everybody respects HR. Although then actually sometimes it can be a bit difficult, because I remember once I was running a leadership workshop, and in the first session, the whole aim was to get people talking. And it got to the coffee break and somebody came up to me and said, oh, I was really interested in what you were saying earlier, da, 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 da. And I said, well, why didn't you say that in the group? Because that would have been really useful input. And he said, because HR are in the room. So that was really sad. They were so powerful in that organization that actually people didn't feel that they could talk to them. So you can actually go too far the other way. So we've got these different types of HR people, or different contexts for HR. Actually, we've got organizations which, even from startup, they've got HR front and center, and the whole organization is built with people in mind, and they're focused on engagement. They develop their leaders. And you get others where HR is a bit of an afterthought, because they start getting themselves into trouble, and that's why they get HR in. It's more of a risk management approach rather than a value adding approach. So I think when we're developing HR people, we've got to respect the environment that they're in, and it can be their own boss. Been coaching a CHRO recently who, she left her company. She was bullied by her boss who didn't rate HR, came into the company and was just determined that HR were not going to be on the senior leadership board. Yeah. So they had to part company. So it's not about the level you're at either. It really is about being able to align what HR does with what the business is trying to do. And I think that HR leaders, again, whatever level, they might be a manager, they might be so I'm using leaders in the term that Tim would like, which is, it's people who
lead change or
who want to actually lead change, whether they got the job title or not, is really help their HR teams to understand that if it's good for business, it is good for people. We tend to think that, for example, D&I is a good area. We know that we've all got to, we want to show the numbers of the diversity statistics that we've got. We want to show that we're including people. But the real rationale for that isn't a values-based one. It's a business-based one. So we have to help HR people be really fluent with the business argument for diversity. So, because that will help them then to help, so that business leaders will see it as good for business and not just an HR activity.
I get really animated and I'm trying to center myself and be all zen right now. Diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's there's a really interesting transition where I feel like we're at a precipice from a HR perspective of we either step fully into being the change agents we could be to get better outcomes in the DEI space, or we're probably in the wrong space in some respects. And what I mean by that is, it's like anything, right? We've got a legacy where functions have transitioned, where we start and we legislate certain things. And then so we do things because there's a compliance element to it. Safety went through a very similar journey, and now we're linking through psychosocial hazards, and, whether it's bullying or we're acknowledging that those things are safety issues in workplaces as well. So it's shifting the dialogue a bit. But it then becomes a culture conversation from my perspective around, if you have a culture of inclusivity and a culture of belonging where we do authentically want people to bring their whole selves to work, then most of the things we do would have nothing to do with DEI numbers. And I think the diversity is really important because you can only be what you can see. I think having equity and equal access to programs is really important because not everyone's coming from the same starting point. But then that inclusivity is the bit where I feel like we're not quite hitting the mark, but I think it's just because it's another element, or it feels like it's another element of culture and culture change that feels hard. And I think I like to acknowledge that with people. It's hard. And I think that there's, a different kind of conversation that can come with parts of that. But I would have people say to me every week, I don't believe in all that DEI stuff. And I think that's where it depends on what side you're sitting in terms of that business argument, the values.
And what colour you are and what gender you are and your sexuality.
Ableism, all of it. Right. And I think so our challenge, and in terms of if we're levelling up HR, would be that we are treading that line in the middle, which it feels like a tension all the time, where we are bringing the values-based leadership and the business commercial acumen to the table, and that we can have a conversation around it being the right thing to do. But we're not going to get a voice and executive buy-in if it's but we have to, it's just because, we have to be able to show the productivity impacts and the growth that can come from you know, having really positive work environments and, you know, non-toxic workplaces, and how that can kind of really make a difference from a productivity perspective and from an innovation perspective. So in organizations, and again, it comes back to when you talk about the context, the industry, there's a different appetite in some industries over others for innovation. And so I think that and tech's a good example of this, but in others, if you have that appetite for innovation, then generally you will be trying to bring in as much inclusivity as possible, because that's where the sharing of ideas comes from, because people feel safe to share, if that makes sense.
I think the safety analogy is a really good one, because this is now a business risk. As safety was, it was obvious that safety was a business risk. But even so, once you give a job to someone like the safety manager, people think, oh, it's not my job then, it's the safety manager's job. So I do think that there is a time dynamic here when we do have to make a lot of noise about things at the beginning. And I have to say, I am old enough to remember when we did not have equal pay. In one of my first HR jobs, we were bringing in equal pay. So in my jobs as a teenager, I was not paid the same as the boys doing the same job. Now we look back and we think, that's incredible. Really? Was that ever the case? We still do it.
Some areas we still do it.
Well, that's true, isn't it? But you know, it's well hidden.
We've made
so. I think we've got to have some patience as well, but we've got to make the business argument. And as you say, in some organizations, they say, well, yeah, we really do want good ideas from everyone, because we recognize that our market is diverse. And that's one of the best cases to make for diversity. We want our workforce to reflect our market. But if you're in a sector where actually you'd rather people didn't come up with ideas, you just want them to sit there and get on with the job, then you may not be so interested in it.
And not so interested in trying to recruit different kinds of people. That's where we have the clone campaign, you know, where we're recruiting the same of the same. And, you know, and I think that there's a challenge, you know, in that shift away from, you know, oh, we're recruiting for culture fit. It's like, well, no, we should be culture misfit, really. Well, probably in my regard. But, you know, like it's trying to look at where, if you're trying to shift a culture, though, then you would need to proactively be defining the kind of people that you would need to come in. But you also then need to prepare those people for the fact that we want this culture. We believe you'll be phenomenal at helping us to shift this culture. That may not be your lived experience when you first join us, but that's where we're going. And this is how we're going to support you in that transition. I think it's an interesting time when the transition's happening. And I know from a safety perspective, you know, and this goes back years now, but it shifted things where it was like, you know, your real reason for, you know, being safe at work is not at work at all. And all the campaigns are around family and, you know, it's going home to the people you love kind of thing. It's how do we bring that sentiment, but the business element into the DEI space? I think it'll be interesting as we move forward. We want to open up for questions. If anyone wants to put their hand up, please do come in. I'm just trying to see there's a few people that had to leave at 5. Tim, hit us up. No? Oh, that's Tim?
Okay, yeah, Sam, I'm sorry for putting my hand up yet again. I haven't seen.
Well, there's not 5 hands up, Tim, so jump in.
Okay, I'm looking at something slightly different. Like, and all the time, every time I discuss HR with in these types of forum, we're always talking about HR units in organisations. One of the issues that I've come across, especially in my conversations with students and others, is the practice of HR rather than HR units. And I'm looking at SMEs, small, medium businesses, whose only contact with HR may be a roving consultant, if they're lucky. But they still practice HR, and I believe very poorly overall. And this is something which isn't really closely looked at And this is where also businesses could thrive if they got the right mix between strategy at that small business level and employees.
Mm. So Tim, just to clarify, so in terms of when you talk about HR unit versus, so what's your observation around what's happening in that SME space? Is it that...
Well, not any HR people as such, it's given to, the job is a transactional job given to the clerical assistant directed by the boss.
Yeah. So I think a lot of the time that's the transition difficulty, right? Where we've got smaller businesses who are then scaling. My observation and experience has been that they grow to a point where the HR people are brought in really late, you know, true kind of HR strategists that can make a difference, but that's also part of business owners. There are some challenges then in recognizing that that's an investment. So I have some interesting conversations with business owners at what point you hire a HR person.
Yes.
And I think that, you know, because even if you don't have a person in there full time, you need that expertise from the beginning. In my experience, from the first time you build a business. What are your thoughts, Debbie?
Yeah, I think, as you say, when it's a small business, the temptation is to hire an admin person. But you're making a big statement then that actually you see HR as admin. Whereas actually, if you're really committed to people being an essential differentiating factor in your business, you'd have your HR guy on the board right from the beginning. And you'd really discuss all the factors. Sorry, Tim.
Except that there's a general, I don't know, it's not a rule as such, but generally between 30 and 50 or between 20 and 40, 50 people, there doesn't seem to be room for a HR person. It's not seen to be a necessary part of the business.
I think a lot of that depends on what exposure the rest of the board or the business owner has had to really impactful HR people. So I feel like that also depends on what council they've had. I know some phenomenal HR talent that have gone into small business right in the early stages when they're still less than 10 people. But that business has a really strong scale-up strategy. And so, you know, that business is looking at a growth of kind of 60, 70% within 12 to 24 months. You know that there's a workforce planning kind of projection that's going to come with that, you know, that there needs to be a strategy of, you know, what the organisation design aspects is where it's undercooked the most, in my experience, from the early phases. And so you build roles that then you're just tacking bits on. But I think it's really, I think it's more the norm, Tim, what you're describing, that's not in there early enough.
It's not in early enough.
But I think that's also just because the reality is I don't think SMEs can pay enough for the people they need in there.
Yes,
so I think there's a competition, you know, there's a competition with, you know, in-house HR practitioners in larger organisations. And so there's a pay conversation and consideration that needs to happen. And I think that therein lies some education that's needed in terms of what this investment in HR will add in terms of value to the business.
Yes, and the roving HR consultants just do transactional stuff to get businesses out of trouble mostly.
Yeah. Do we have any other questions?
Can I just come in there? Because I think that the interesting thing is that they might think to themselves, so if we imagine a small leadership team from a new startup or an SME, and they're thinking, we haven't got enough for HR to do. Why do we, you know, what value would they add a full-time senior HR person? Actually, we need HR people to be regarded as business leaders who happen to have a HR expertise. And I think that's where HR's ability to be the coach, to be the sounding board, to help people really think about where they're going with their business. Because very often, especially if they're in a growth phase, they will be thinking about their business model going forward.
Yeah.
And clearly their people model, their organization structure, the resources they need in different areas of the business. That should be a key part of strategizing that and making sure that you can actually get the people that you need. So I'm working with two rapid startups at the moment where really they do, the conversations the HR directors are having are around how might the organization structure look in 2 years' time, 3 years' time, 5 years' time. Because, for example, we're in a tech business and we need a pipeline for those people. So we need to plan ahead to make sure that we can get them.
And I think it's, we know it's needed, right? Because all of us on this call generally are, you know, in the space where we either work in HR or we believe in HR, we have an appetite for being influential and impactful in HR. And I think that, you know, when we talk about taking HR to the next level, I feel like the thing that we need to take away from some of these conversations is, what are we going to do to deliberately create the space? I feel suffocated when we talk about the bucket analogy, because I feel like I'm being buried alive. But I'll try and process that. But I think that you know, where we do have that feeling of overwhelm, it's really hard to step out, look in with some different perspective, to prioritize proactively building connections and relationships that before you need them. So it's networking 101 as well, isn't it? Really, it's kind of, you know, you want to build genuine relationships with people, and to have some of that credibility in terms of runs on the board, in terms of the actual work we do, so the expertise and what it is that we do. But it's also setting the time aside for strategy, you know. And I have HR leaders that I work with laugh at me most of the time when I'm like, so how much time have you got set aside in your diary to be able to like reflect, focus, strategize? And, you know, it takes a good 15 minutes for people to stop laughing and to get off the floor. And I can appreciate, you know, I've worked in senior HR roles for, you know, more than 15 years of my, you know, 20 kind of whatever it is, 25 years. So I get it. Like, I get that it's really hard when you're in it and you're overwhelmed, but that's where I feel like we need to take purposeful action to be able to shift things. So proactively having time set aside where it's like, who are the stakeholders that are going to have the biggest impact for me, and then set time aside to build relationships with them. Be immersing myself in the business. And as you said, Debbie, kind of talking with business leaders, you know, getting out and talking and being among the workforce. Like, it's, you know, I have a lot of clients where they say, we haven't seen HR for 18 months. And there's probably some good reason for that, but we can't afford to not have that visibility. So those are some things that come to mind for me in terms of, but I acknowledge that it's hard. It's hard when you're really busy. And something you said earlier, Debbie, around the tech space, I would agree with you that we sometimes will try and drive a digital transformation, which in my experience rarely works, where we try and fix everything with an automated solution. And in my experience, it's too much change, too big. Business leaders resent it because they've just got used to using whatever it is. So it is trying to look at integration. It is trying to look at, there's amazing apps that can integrate things now, where if we think about the user experience and our business leaders as users, and if we think about it from that perspective, and we think about the fact that one size doesn't fit all in organizations in terms of the services and the products that we might be putting out there, I think that that'll start to shift some of the mindset and some of the branding that HR are having.
The branding things, interesting. You know, the one single thing, or the first thing, if I could have my time again, wouldn't that be great?
Yeah.
You know, I mean, if somebody says, would you like to be young again? Well, yes, if I could actually take with me all the experience that I've got now.
The wisdom.
One of the things that I would do differently is quite simple. I would make a buddy in the finance department.
Yeah. So you'll hang out with a finance person.
I'd hang out with a finance person.
Marketing person.
I would make sure that I understood the numbers.
Yeah.
when I went out with anyone in the business, I'd be talking to them about the numbers. That reminds me, this was funny. I went to Italy, and there was the sales manager was supposed to be sort of, being my chauffeur, taking me around everywhere. He kept holding my hand. I'm in the car and he's reaching his hand across to hold my hand. And I'm saying, well, tell me, what are the sales numbers in Italy? No, I know it was a bit of a cultural experience, but we have got to make sure that, the gender thing was obviously a factor there. And we've got to be honest that it sometimes is in HR as well. And that's just taken you off in a weird direction.
I've gone to it, yeah.
But I had to think, why did that happen? I was saying to myself afterwards, why did that guy think that it was appropriate? So we have to project ourselves as business leaders. And sometimes that means we've got to actually say it. We need to rehearse something. She talked about brand. I think that's really important, because the thing about brand does make us focus on all the different elements of how we come across.
Yeah.
And so we need to make sure that if within our image or our brand, whichever word works for you, we want to be seen as business leaders who happen to be in HR, then that means we've got to tell people that's who we are. We've got to use that language all the time. And if that's not the position that you're in right now, then it's important to take time to get into that position. What would it take for me to shift the perception that other people have of us as a function, as me as an individual within that function? What do I believe myself? And I think this is really where it's got to start, because in the report, for anybody who's read it, you'll see I use the cycle of the self-fulfilling prophecy. So that's where we can either be the victims of our beliefs, or we can manage our beliefs positively. So let's imagine you go into a meeting and your belief at that moment is you're there as an HR person. So you wait until HR is mentioned on the agenda. You only speak up when it's an HR matter. When people ask you about the HR stuff, you reply with the HR stuff. So you reinforce their belief, because that's how you respond. So you come in with that belief, you reinforce it, that's how you behave, that reinforces their belief of you, and so you don't actually make progress. Whereas if you go into that meeting with the belief, I'm here as a business leader and I add value to the business, then that means that you do speak up when they're talking about an issue or an opportunity that isn't an HR issue. You do it in a really credible way. You maybe ask some questions that HR are really valued for the questions that they ask. You ask them questions that then help them to think about their area. So that makes them think, oh, this is great. Actually, this person really adds value to our meetings. And so their response to you is much more what you want. That increases your confidence. So you create an upward cycle. So you've just got to start somewhere.
Yeah. And I think part of that, when I'm listening to you talk about that, is also challenging our perceptions. So, we start with that self-awareness, but we need to get feedback. We need to get insights on how we are viewed by the business, to then be able to kind of come up with a plan of attack of how to shift our brand, how to reposition ourselves. It's hard to know how to do that when you don't know how you're viewed or how people receive you. And I think so that's an element, and similarly with your tool, the Enable HR profiling system, like the 360, and that is really helpful at, it's all about perceptions, right? These are my perceptions of myself, perceptions of my clients. you know, and perceptions of leadership. So I think, because if you don't have some information to work from, it's hard to then you're just kind of throwing things against the wall, right? You've got to put your energy in a space where it's going to have the most impact. Otherwise, when you are depleted of energy as it is, just because there's so much going on, then you need to be really careful around where you invest your energy. You don't want to be putting it into the space where it's not going to make a difference. You want to put it into the space where the stakeholders are going to help be levers for change for you. You know, the partnerships that you're building are going to help build on, you know, your credibility as a business leader. You know, I think that there's still this kind of delicate balance that we have all the time around our brand and the perception of whether we're on the side of the employer and the side of the employee. That's a conversation for a whole another day. I've just realized it's 6 minutes to go. So, but you know, that's something where it's difficult. It can be tricky, but I think to tread that line is around having the credibility and being able to have kind of a bit of awareness around where it is that you need to kind of shift things, and to speak it, to be able to shift kind of that brand and perception. So before we kind of wrap up for this session, Deborah, what if you were reimagining HR, or, you know, what does reimagining HR mean to you?
Well, the first word that comes to my mind is confidence.
Yeah.
We're not a very confident function, and yet our area really does hold the key to profitability, to growth, to success in any marketplace. But it's got to come back to this business thing. I keep coming back to that. So when you were saying earlier, decide where you're going to invest. That decision has to be made from a business perspective.
Yeah.
What we tend to do is say good HR, good practice, for example, means performance management, learning and development, reward. That's all HR speak.
Yeah.
We need to identify our priorities by talking to business leaders. They'll give us some surprises. They'll say things that you hadn't thought of. And then you can go off and develop those, knowing that when you bring them back to the business, they will be embraced.
Yeah.
They'll be embedded. And then you get the satisfaction of having really added value.
Yeah.
And you can prove that you've added value.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's one of the things that I'm going to be having a conversation with Alicia Mackay in New Zealand. She calls herself straight talking strategist, and she is just that. But it's how you can align and connect the strategy, the leadership, the culture, you know, so that we can kind of shift the needle in this space. So be interesting to talk more. But as always, thank you for your time. It's always lovely to talk with you. And for those that might be catching this on the recording and not live, on Reimagine HR's digital event platform, you can raise questions with us on the event page. We'd be happy to come back and respond to anyone that's on the call now. If you walk away and think, I wish I'd asked that, please do come onto the event page. Always happy to talk all things about enabling great HR. So thanks for joining us today, and we will see you next time. Thanks, Debbie.
And please link in with me. I'd love to connect with you.
Yeah,
so
that'd be awesome.
We can keep in touch.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.